Welcome everyone to Camp.Fire. My name is Rob Beeler from Beeler.Tech, and I wanted to just give a quick preamble and then really kind of dive in quickly into this topic because I think we're going to have so much to discuss today. Camp.Fire is really about pulling together our community and hearing multiple voices on a particular topic. Instead of just doing it as a panel where one person represents all publishers, I want a mix of publisher voices. I want a mix of people from different aspects and so forth. And so we've put this together in part because really over the last number of months, just the conversation around bid requests and how the actual signal that comes from a publisher to an SSP to a DSP has just become vitally important that we actually understand what's going on there. And to me, one of the greatest resources, at least in my world, since I've known him at when he was at VP of Product at Index Exchange, is Michael Sullivan, who is now the CEO and co-founder of Sincera. I'm going to have Mike explain Sincera kind of in the course of things. But there's this aspect of going, this is someone who knows programmatic inside and out, has his perspective. I want to bring some other perspectives into this conversation. And what I'm going to ask all of you to do is, by all means, line up your questions. Let's get to those particular things. But the flow of things is I'm going to have a conversation with Mike. I get to have a convo with him by myself. I'm going to be greedy in that way. Then I'll bring in the roundtable. That information is already in the chat as to who's joining us. Bring them into this conversation, and along the way, look for your feedback on this. Ultimate goal here is I really want to make sure that we leave with some ideas of things you can do and things to be paying attention to and so forth, whether that be work with a partner to working with your own internal resources. A couple things, I'm going to throw this out really for our roundtable participants. Yield to new voices. So I want to get as many people speaking as possible. Get to the point. No one-upmanship. No pitching. And I also just want to throw this for the whole audience. This is not a pay-to-play arrangement, okay? I didn't ask Mike, Sincera did not sponsor this. I chose to work with Mike on this because, again, I think his view on this is extremely helpful to people across the ecosystem. I have invited some of our partners, Beeler.Tech partners, to participate in the conversation. And of course, we have our publisher community, the people that kind of raise their hand and so forth. And so with that, I want to get my conversation going on with Mike. Mike, can you come up to the stage?
Webinar.
There we go. Awesome, Mike. Thanks for joining me. I think, well, I didn't say much about you at this point. I don't think I misspoke in any way, shape, or form. It would be good for people, since I've kind of played you up here. What is Sincera and your kind of where you fit in the ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So one, definitely pleasure to be here. Excited to talk to you all today. Two, Sincera is, I guess, a slightly different kind of ad tech company. I think some people, like, we deal in data, like that's the first thing to understand. But I think most data companies in ad tech are data providers. They are in service of transacting data, on campaigns and things like that. And we provide metadata about ad environments, amongst other things. We basically built a product that would generate new signal, find and generate new signal quickly that can be used for a variety of different things. So it can be used to build new ad products. So for example, this is public. IAS's MFA AI is powered significantly by Sincera data. And so you can build new ad products, you can learn about competitors, you can do all sorts of things, you can optimize and enrich bid requests, you can find out new things like, hey, if I'm a buyer, is this video that I'm buying on this publisher actually shrinking down and sticky to the bottom right? Things of that nature. So it's really all about information and data in the classical sense. It's not data in the sense of we are an audience provider, you're transacting on this, you're paying us a CPM. So all that to say is like, that allows us to have our North Star to be as accurate as possible in sort of, understanding an environment and sort of report on that as truthfully as we can. And we don't have any sort of incentive to have a campaign deliver or anything of that nature.
Got it. Thank you. And one of the things for everyone listening is that you can go to the Sincera site and you can look up, again, like you can look up your site and you can understand what is being measured, which I think is going to be an underlying theme to some of the conversation today, again, which is publishers need to understand how they're being measured and in what ways, and that starts to get into how to differentiate, how to get more buys, is understanding again how these things are decided. So, Mike, one of the things I wanted to start off with is that you gave a presentation. I wasn't there, but at the IAB Tech Lab event, you gave this presentation that again I heard across the world. All right, I was in London, but I heard all about it, right? That you had done this great presentation and people really thought very highly of what you presented. And there's a line that you use on one of your slides there. It's like the bid request data is valuable, but falls short of describing the full picture, good and bad. Now, I want to kind of start there because as a publisher, right, I'm thinking that I want buyers to see the best of me, to get what I need from that, right? And what you're saying is that my bid request is not really saying exactly kind of what's going on. Can you elaborate on your point there? And I'm happy to throw the slide up when you're ready.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
tell me when.
Yeah, sure. So I think the starting point of that is that, it's not an emotional sort of statement. Like in purely, objective terms, a bid request is what, 10, 20, 40 kilobytes. A web page, URL loads 10, 15, 20 megabytes. So there is, a very specific and like quote unquote physical compression of what is, the richness and the complexity and the subtlety of the environment that exists and what, regular users see, right? Versus what a programmatic buyer sees. So in that compression, different things can happen. There can be situations where something can be, can operate in the gray and over-represent something. I think sometimes that happens today, I think with floating video and sticky video players, for example, where it's not clear that exactly what the buyer is buying. But it can happen in the other way too, where, really great publishers who invest heavily into journalism and an awesome browsing experience and a lighter than normal ad load don't have those amazing attributes included on the bid request. And so the bid request is a very flattening event, you know what I mean? So again, like think about how some people, maybe this is not the right analogy, but like some people talk about like the richness and the warmth of listening to vinyl. And then you listen to like a heavily compressed MP3 from 1999. And it's like, yeah, you're not going to, can you really tell who is the best, classical pianist? If you're taking those like Tchaikovsky, I don't even know if he's a pianist, but, if you're taking those examples and sort of compressing it down. And yeah, so this is the slide that sort of illustrates this, right? Like the bid request is highly reproducible, highly transferable, can operate at insane scale. But in order to do that, there has to be compromises. And that compromise is in the fidelity of the information that's transferred, right? So all of the things that like make up the image on the right are like sort of compressed down to the sort of, I won't say the bare minimum, but to what are the most visible, important differentiation or like, criteria that exists here. So like, maybe if you would be like, hey, we're doing, open dog 2.7, and now we're going to include the fact that, this dog's name is Reggie and that he is inside and not outside. And like, that's the example of like the level of fidelity and conversation that happens. But what you have to like keep in mind is like this monstrous compression that occurs, right, in order to facilitate this standardization. And that was really more the point. And like in that sort of compression to standardization, things can be, misrepresented, I think, to buyers, and buyers can feel like they've had the wool pulled over their eyes. But also from publishers, things that make publishers uniquely great can be sort of compressed or eliminated and don't get transferred to buyers. So it kind of goes both ways, but it's this compression function that creates this pressure.
And I think that that's, and I remember one of the things again that like kicked off this conversation, and Mike, why I wanted to kind of bring you into this, right? And then it was interesting kind of your response, because there was an aspect that within our community, there's so much conversation from the publisher perspective about what's in the bid request, what do I add to the bid request, and working that particular angle. And I think what you're saying, in part, right, is that because of the amount of compression, and by the way, I'm just going to warn everyone, there are going to be now dog analogies. I started the whole thing off with salmon analogies, and now we're going to go to vinyl, I think, which is just going to be a perfect one of just sitting there going like, you can be the greatest artist in the world, but again, if all you actually deliver is MP3s, some of that is kind of lost there and just isn't then even really a part of the decision process, right? And I think that that is one of the key things that, again, as we pull back into things that we'll bring into with the roundtable and so forth. But so let me kind of go to there, right, which is this direction of like, okay, so Jake, you don't belong up here yet. Get out of here. But there's a part, Mike, that things like, so one of the things I'm hearing though is that in that compression is some things I might as a publisher want to do is add more identifiers, right? To seller defined audiences, to all of these types of things. And my question to you then is then how does that work in terms of that work getting into the bid request to that then kind of going through the path? And again, what the publisher part of this that controls that? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah. I think there's two things here. I think that you mentioned. I think there are things that publishers can do within bid requests that will help their monetization. No question. And we'll touch on a couple of those in a few minutes. And then there are things that you can do that are speculative that could have an impact on monetization. Some of the cookieless IDs are sort of in there. And then I think there are, the third category is I think things that publishers invest in that are unlikely to have an impact on monetization. And then the fourth one, which I think is the least explored things, is the things publishers do in and around bid requests that have a huge impact on monetization that they don't even realize. So it's this universe. It's like, I hear from publishers who say, well, I tested this new ID solution, and I found out that it didn't seem to make a big difference in my ad spend, or it did make a big difference in my ad spend. It's like, well, did you control for using ID bridges like a 33 across? Are you sure that the SSPs that you're using aren't using 33 across without you maybe not even knowing about it? Right. And so like there's like, and unless you kind of know all of the components that are happening, it's very difficult to actually just even get effective correlation, not necessarily causation insights. Right. So you sort of going in, going back to sort of my first piece, like I think there are things that can be in the bid request that are very helpful. They're very bread and butter, but it's very important to get them right. And we see a lot of publishers, who maybe are just wide of the mark. So I'll give you an example. Having your ad units be correctly configured, having GPIDs being correctly declared and transferred and transmitted are critically important, right? And so I think that is not something that's not like, oh, in OpenRTB 2.8, there's a new field for the fuzzy wuzzy, and make sure you declare your fuzzy wuzzy to be type 2 or type 4. And it's like, yes, there are new things that come out. Yes, it's important to support them broadly. But there's a limited amount of fuzzy wuzzies that kind of go into a bid request that need to be declared. And sort of like once you've sort of audited that, you'll sort of be at the terminus of that work. I do think, though, publishers spend a lot of time on things that are in what are called like the extended fields, right? Like, so a great example of this, I think, is seller-defined audiences. So this was launched with a lot of fanfare and a lot of excitement and expectation on the pub side. And I think to date, I think it's fair to say that there's been no real adoption or transactions occurring. And there's a very easy physical explanation to this, which is that DSPs and SSPs are not going to do work to support data that is inconsistent and somewhat available, somewhat not available across publishers, right? There's a reason why Deal ID is sort of this universal transaction-based flag that tells you this opportunity has some sort of criteria, some sort of condition that's good. And that's amazing. And it's very very widely applicable in a bunch of different scenarios. And that's what makes Deal ID so successful and so good. But seller-defined audiences in these like nested JSONs that are different. And, I'm a publisher, I'm going to put my audiences in and I have my own thing. And how many other publishers? And it's like, let's just pick on someone. I'm Mediavine and I'm going to put something in, the segment taxonomy for seller-defined audiences. It's like, no one is really going to build to that, because that's basically saying, do you want to spend your engineering time at a DSP or an SSP to build like basically something that only one or two or n number of publishers are using? So that's a good heuristic that, with the exception of maybe the user field, which has been promoted from EXT to others, but like just to be very tactical, I'm always very dubious of something that's in the extended objects field within OpenRTB, because there's no structure. And if there's no specific structure, it's not predictable for SSPs and DSPs. And if it's not predictable, they're not going to do the work to pick it up, right?
I think that's a really interesting point, right? Because I think that there's an aspect of what you just said of going, in a perfect world, an SSP is looking at all that stuff and finding that maybe something adds performance, does better, is worth passing on, DSPs react to or whatever. But to your point, and again, it's not SSPs not wanting to do the work. It's if it's not a consistent thing, if it doesn't, again, it's one of the things that you talked about to me in the past has been just, again, there is an aspect of this that this is machines talking to other machines, talking to other machines on some of these pieces to it. And so there's an aspect of talking like a machine is part of the piece of this, because if you're just adding, again, fuzzy wuzzies where none of the systems are looking for fuzzy wuzzies or speaking fuzzy wuzzy, I can't believe we're going down this road, Mike. This is going to come back out to haunt us, I think. But there's a part of it of going like that. To me sounds like that it's the SDA could have a future, but only when it really, again, moves to the next level of actually, it's got to pass some tests. And right now it doesn't do that. So no one's
Yeah.
going to invest in the buying process to build off that. Does that sound
I
right?
think, yeah, I think that's right. But it's not just seller-defined audiences. It's a lot of things that's in the
Oh yeah.
extended field. But like the point being is that publishers can spend a lot of time optimizing and experimenting with fields in the bid requests that won't ultimately have a material impact, or are highly unlikely to have an impact on ad spend and monetization. And that's sort of the macro point. And then I would say specifically, I think it's difficult for humans. Like you just said it yourself. You're like, oh, I'm a publisher and I thought it might add it. And I thought, well, wouldn't the SSPs are like, well, maybe this is interesting. It's like, that's not how these machines think. These machines process hundreds of billions of transactions a day. They don't think, they just route, right? And so, it's not that someone product or engineering at an SSP don't think seller-defined audiences are interesting. I'm sure to a certain degree they are, but is it the most interesting thing that they could be working on? No.
And so there's a piece of the, we're going to keep kind of circling back to that, right? I think there's an aspect though. Okay, so as a publisher, I think some great points in terms of like where you put your energy. And we're gonna expand on that with the roundtable. And I know you have some ideas on that. I think the one thing we kind of started with is understanding as a publisher and correctly passing things through, right? Um, and one thing that you mentioned that I've heard, and I'm going to give credit to Rise Codes. Ken mentioned this to me once. Just like not all the SSPs even accept like have different character limits on certain fields and stuff like that. Like there is some getting all of the technical things correct that will kind of is important. But to your part of it's what is actually getting past the SSP, nailing that, but then understanding what the SSP then does with that bid request, right? And this to me is the salmon going to the next level here. And there's a piece of it of going like SSPs then look at that bid request and you could use the word enrichment, modification, optimize to just letting it die. There's a lot of stuff that the SSP is doing, one on behalf of publishers and one on, and again, this is not trying to be nefarious, but in the interest of the SSP, right? Because, and again, I want you to kind of elaborate on my general point here, which is they then are going to take whatever that and send it to a DSP. And if they know it's not going to win, they're not going to pass it, right? They can lose business overall if by
Definitely.
doing wrong by the DSP, but they also sometimes know more about an impression than a publisher does, and so they're working that angle. One, generally speaking, am I in the right ballpark? And B, can you elaborate any particular point that might again be helpful to kind of
Yeah,
dive?
yeah. So you are correct. There is some modification enrichment that the SSP engages in. I would say that the good SSPs are pretty forthright in talking to publishers and explaining why, and also giving publishers the controls if they so desire to optimize against that, right? And so yes, there is some enrichment that occurs, and
So
I think that's like, yeah,
can we just dive into that for just like 1 second? So in other words, something like ID bridging, which again it became the hot topic in May. Was it April? May. Already feels like years ago. But there's a part of that like somehow suddenly everyone got all freaked out about this particular practice. And the fact of the matter is that some of this is just kind of standard how things operate. The key for a publisher is to understand whether the SSP is doing this and again how they are approaching this. Why
yeah,
are they doing that? When are they doing that? And
yeah.
understanding that because again, your product is being essentially again your representation you're asking SSPs to represent you to a DSP, and there's an
Mhm.
aspect of going like sometimes they dress you up, they button up your shirt, and other times again they're just like
I
they're
don't know
with
if you want to finish that sentence,
yeah, I
uh,
know. I
but
realize all the analogies, that's the one we're
yeah,
bailing on.
but I think that's right, and I think ID bridging is a bit of a Rubicon, no pun intended, because I think there's a bunch of different ways that it can be executed, right? And I think certainly a lot of buyers, they felt, and I think understandably, that, hey, I'm getting sent on Safari traffic, Chrome ID, that I am then bidding against, but you haven't even told me you're engaging in this enrichment. So I think there is a spectrum of enrichments and enhancements that can happen. Like here's a very like innocuous example of of enrichment is marketplace curation. Your bid request comes off the page and it goes to Index or Xandr or Rubicon, and they look at like all the eligible packages and combinations that has. Those deal IDs are appended to that bid request and it goes out the door. Like that's pretty non-controversial for the most part. There are edges, but so that's non-controversial and that's very straightforward enrichment. I think ID bridging is different because in some cases the publishers weren't even aware that this was occurring. So again, that's I think the importance of understanding what your SSPs are doing. And two, the buyers certainly didn't know, and that's another example of again going back to the gray that occurs from like the fidelity of the full environment down to the structured JSON, what's getting lost? If it's in the gray, is it acceptable and reasonable by all parties that that's a compression or removal of context, let's say? Or is it something that you want to raise a flag over, right? And so deal ID enrichment is not something that people are going to get upset over because it's standardized, it's well understood. But certainly there were a few people, not about ID bridging overall, although there were a couple of folks like that. I think in specific examples of ID bridging where it wasn't disclosed to the seller, it wasn't disclosed to the, like, meaning the publisher, it wasn't disclosed to the publisher, it wasn't disclosed to the end buyer, and the SSP was monetizing, and that wasn't not obvious. I think some folks had it took issue with that.
Yeah.
Although again, it result in increased monetization for pubs, and it still does to this day. So I think it's just a matter of disclosure.
And so I think there's a piece of that, and again, I want to get to bringing in these other voices, but there's a couple of key things that again was in your presentation, as well as just even something you kind of mentioned, which is one, you know, let me put words in your mouth. You tell me if you disagree. That deal ID, getting a deal ID and having some kind of setup on that obviously is an aspect that if you can get that as part of the bid request, that obviously goes a long way towards that piece, right? Like in terms of like being considered for an actual a bid. The other part of this that we haven't really kind of dove into this, well, you kind of mentioned it first. I'll go to this point, which is just that again, this compression of the signal winds up being just this one aspect of this, but there's an aspect again of like, to your point about the picture of the dog and the photo of the dog, is this aspect of going like, that's really where this is where we start to move away from the bid request conversation and into more about how we actually transact and how publishers are measured and how publishers are signaling. And
Yeah.
if you are doing things on your site, again, you can have the perfect bid request, but if you have 500 SSPs doing this, to exaggerate, not offend anyone, with everyone connected to every single thing, you're signaling something different than someone that's got fewer paths, fewer identity. Like you start to just spray and pray is sending a signal that is going to hurt you.
Yeah, I think a way to think about that is it's like, you're spending so much time optimizing the engine of a car. Do I have the right fuel, oil, spark plugs are brand new. I got this, air filter from Germany. It's amazing. It's for Porsches, da, 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 da. And it's like, yes, but you're missing two of the rear tires. So like, you're just throwing sparks all over the road as you drive down, being like, engine's perfect, humming. And it's like, yes, but like, what's around the engine? And that's a good way of thinking about like bid requests and like what's around the bid request. So like I can give a very specific example if I can share my screen, if that's okay.
Yes.
So this isn't to sort of pick on any one specific publisher. This is, I would say very, very common use case. So what we're going to look at here is CNN. And, whether it's CNN or other publishers, what we hear from many sort of premium pubs is they're like, we're super focused on ad experience. We have a limit of like 15 SSPs, and we're really dialed in on this. And I believe people when they say that. Like I know that is what they are focused on. So it's not a question of like intent or level of effort. And so, but if you actually dig into CNN and you were to say to them, hey, how many how many header wrappers do you use? And they'll be like, well, I guess maybe 2 or 3. Like, I guess we use one for TAM, if you count that. We have our main pre-bid, which is, we optimized. And then I think we have one for video with like JW player, some kind of language like that. And then you show them publishers, it's like, actually, like we've seen 9 in the last 90 days. And you may optimize to 15 bid adapters or 14 bid adapters in your primary main vanilla pre-bid, right? But you have 60 bid adapters in your Vidazoo iframed pre-bid. And by the way, if this is running in an iframe, it is there is a high probability that the URLs that are being disclosed on this are not the full URL. It's just the top level domain. So you now have this floating video that's going out across 60 different SSP adapters. That's only CNN.com, no matter what you're on, what user, what property or URL the user is on. And buyers are just seeing a huge amount of like domains out there or like bid requests that show CNN with like less than full enrichment because it doesn't have the full URL. Now, I'm not saying specifically that is the case in CNN's, in CNN example. I'm saying many wrappers that are within these like non-obvious iframed events or like locations, which are not obvious to like most folks, they don't have access to the full URL. They only see the top level domain because they're inside an iframe. So like, does CNN have a relationship with Talaria, with e-planning, with Qs, I don't even know how to pronounce that, someone can correct me, with Colossus? So my point being is like, the bid request is the engine. It's important to have the engine be tuned and in good working order, and like ad slots, ad configure, like that is very important. But it's not your monetization, how fast you go down the highway is a product of this vehicle and the engine, right? Like, it's not just the engine in and of itself, to belabor another analogy. So that's an example of something where I would say is like, you can optimize, and folks and again, it's not just CNN. I only use that for illustrative purposes, but like we encounter publishers quite frequently who really optimize on that core pre-bid, and that core pre-bid that they have is beautiful. It's immaculate. Everything is enriched cleanly. Everything is structured and declared properly. It's very well done, but they've got 60 other SSP adapters blasting out bid requests that have incomplete information. And by the way, when it goes out, when it's video that goes out on those different SSPs, are they declaring that they're shrinking the video down to the bottom right? So they're sending out like a 700 by 400 video in request, probably set as like in stream or whatever. And then the user scrolls and it has 100% completion because it just finishes in the bottom right-hand corner. Like, no, the buyers don't know that. And they don't know that in the bid request. And when they find out, they're annoyed. And the publishers are like, continuing to focus and enrich and optimize that core pre-bid. But there's this whole other universe of like this, like, oh, we have this vendor that helps us with monetizing and we get this cool check. And that's great. Like, I'm not saying publishers shouldn't engage in those types of, or with those types of vendors. I think you just have to be aware of what the implication is of that vendor. Because by the way, something like the CPU usage of a given URL, how fast the page is impacted by these types of things. If you have 9
Right.
wrappers, like that is almost 9 complete instances of pre-bid, the full wrapper running on a browser on a user's machine. Right. So like, I know they're not always running 9 in concurrent sort of spaces or environments, but even if it's 3 or 4 or 5, like that's a lot. And I don't think a lot of publishers are aware of, when I sign a deal with a vendor like this, like what does that all imply to the overall ad experience?
100%. Again, I think that's one of the things that is that how important speed is, one, from the user experience. And again, I think that that's something we've seen measurable, to how you show up within search engines, all kinds of speed is critical, and your strategy around how many partners and how you do this all is a factor of that. So I've asked the panel to come join this. I am sorry, to our round table, that I was trying to keep up to the volume of back and forth all of you were having. It looks like you guys are having a fantastic chat. Maybe next time we'll have a back room, like a green room camera, just to watch you guys and stuff like that. But it seemed like you were having a lively debate. I think that there are probably multiple points on which Mike hit on that I want that you can certainly touch on. I do think that there's this aspect that I wanted to kind of go back to the start of this again, in terms of like what publishers should doing. So again, we've gone from salmon to fuzzy wuzzies to dogs, now engines. I do think the engine piece is a critical part that um, getting the engine set up correctly is really important and stuff like that. And I kind of want to throw it out to you guys in terms of, again, whether there's something that Mike said or some particular point that you want to add on to that in terms of getting the importance of that signal that we are sending on that someone wants to build off. Who would like to go first? Shy, please.
So, I mean, the point I think that Mike is making is that bid requests try to capture sort of the most salient properties, but it's a map, it's not the territory, it doesn't capture everything, things get flattened out, and specifically, it doesn't capture unique properties like, SDAs that nobody's going to build tech for. However, to your point, there are certain things that need to be in there correct, right? Like GPIDs you mentioned. I think it's probably worth sort of, if we can map that out for all the publishers, like here's the floor, forget about the ceiling. There's no ceiling to optimize. Let's take it as a fact, like there's IDs, whatever, you might see some incremental, but let's make sure that everyone has the basics going out correctly, because I think that's an important piece. So I'd love to hear kind of the take on that.
Yeah, I think so as I mentioned earlier, I think Janet brought up a great point, which is just being really clean. Like I would say two things: being really clean with your ad set, the ad unit and ad element setup. So like basically the slots on the page, how are they defined? I see some publishers who, this is very esoteric, but they'll have like auto generated ad element IDs that are unique every page load, and like that makes it very difficult for end systems to optimize, because it also blows out the cardinality of any kind of reporting they try to do on you, and you may never hear about that. So like having a really structured, clean implementation, and there's lots of services out there. I know like the guys at like hashtag labs and stuff like are very good consultative folks who can advise you on these types of things. But that is like number one, like the slots on the page have to be priority zero. The other one that I would say that I think a lot of people, and we see a lot of logs from DSPs, we see what things are coming down, is you have to be really rigorous that in the case of like web, that you are sending the full URL. Because you may think, yes, that's of course what we want to do. That's like, table stakes. But again, if you are using a vendor who is, basically perhaps building an entire full stack wrapper that's in an iframe, they might not be technically able to send the full URL. And what the DSP sees is, people are saying CNN's always the example, so I'll pick on someone else. So they'll say the Globe and Mail, because I'm Canadian. It's like the Globe and Mail. It's like, yeah, I don't buy from them because they're news and they never share the full URL. So I don't know what the content is about. And the Globe and Mail's like, what? We do, but I mean, we have it set. Look at our pre-bid. So that's one I think people have to be, and publishers have to be like super, super focused on, is like, it's not enough to be like, yes, of course, we did that 4 or 5 years ago. It's like, have you made any other decisions and configurations to your ad stack since then? Are you working with any third-party vendors that involve any kind of monetization? Are you 100% sure that they're broadcasting the URL? Like that's one I think is a very high level, easy, obvious one that will have a direct impact on ad spend. And I know for a fact, because I see DSP logs, that there are a number of publishers who don't include the full URL.
So I think that's a really good takeaway. And again, I'm looking for other pieces of this. I'm going to throw this out. And again, some of this is just out of my not playing completely at this level. Is there an aspect of this where what I send to one SSP, like as a publisher, that instead of building the perfect one bid request to then send out to all the SSPs, I am sending different things to different SSPs with all of that in mind? Is that over engineering a problem, or is that kind of a part
like
of
having one SSP get some data, one SSP get another?
Yeah.
I mean, you can try it. I don't know if you're going to get much value out of that personally. I think what would be more interesting to me as a publisher is if you have two identical bid requests, and is the spend from downstream DSPs or brands or seats from different DSPs into those SSPs materially different? Because that's what I would be curious about. Is like, how much of these, like, what do we get from these these SSPs that's unique versus, you know, from others?
Yeah, got it. Justin,
That's where I would spend my time.
yeah, Justin, please.
Yeah, so I know there's a lot of roundtablists here, and I'd love to welcome their voices in. As some commentary for the audience who's been listening, I'm at Snopes.com, and I spend most of my time thinking about the quality of our bid requests, and I still don't know quite the extent of all that goes on between my SSPs and DSPs. So collectively, as a community here, we're reaching a point where standards can be defined, best practices can be defined, and I hope what you'll hear here is lots of different people on the roundtable taking individual approaches to this larger problem that I think collectively we'll all solve together.
I would just chime in, like, just because I want to try this analogy out. I've been thinking, I think like the fundamental problem that's being described right now is essentially like fragmentation. And when you look at SSPs and when you look at DSPs, these are software systems, code on servers, and they operate independently. And publishers are calling them individually. And like each of those systems has been engineered individually by people. And so it's like the analogy that I'm like, want to share here is it's like trying to, like, when you're calling the SSPs, it's like trying to figure out what's going on in someone's head. Like they literally need to tell you, because like some of those things that you're sending to one SSP, the other SSP may not understand. And so it's like, how can you ever know what's going on in someone else's head without actually having them tell you? And so that's why like the dialogue is like so important, to know how these systems really react to different things. And so I think that experiment that Mike mentioned is super valid. And again, different DSPs and different SSPs will react differently. And as pre-bid adapters come out for DSPs directly, we're going to continue to see that issue, right? Like, and that's why the standards are going to be so important in the publisher. And, the floor that Shai brought up is like so important. Like all of these systems should react to the data that we're sending them in the requests in the same, ideally, like should is a powerful word, but like ideally, I think they operate that way. And I think the idea that they don't is where a lot of the confusion comes in. And so like building consensus around the format of the request will be super important moving forward.
I want to just add even another level to John's point there. So as a publisher, it's super important for you to have or try to have these conversations with each exchange. What has been kind of mind-blowing to me, looking at this from a high level, is a lot of what SSPs will call as optional parameters in the pre-bid request become not so optional when they reach out to you and say, hey, why aren't you passing this, right? And certain parts of a pre-bid request, SSP1, let's say PubMatic, just making this up as an example, say you have to pass this in on a video request. SSP2 will say, do not pass it in, that will literally break our request, right? And so while there are like minimums that every request should have, and frankly, from my opinion, like that should just be built into pre-bid itself and like make it very simple for publishers not to have to worry about that. Each exchange has some very specific requirements that their own documentation will not tell you until you have that conversation with like the right person at that exchange, whether that's your account manager, someone on their development team, or the buying team, or whatever it may be. We've uncovered a lot of very specific information from one exchange to the next over the last, 5-6 years. That has kind of it's been very surprising.
And
Jared, that's if, sorry, Bill, Rob, that's if you can even talk to somebody at the exchange. And how many exchanges as a publisher with your resourcing can you afford to talk to? And that's if somebody at the exchange who actually understands how the exchange works, which I can tell you your average support person or account manager cannot. So I'm very, very adamant that like there are many publishers who have these deep relationships and are leaders for the industry and represent our collective success based off these privileged relationships. Most of us are setting up Google, Amazon, and Prebid And whatever Google, Amazon, and Prebid have structured is what we do. And we don't know anything else. And unless these companies are coming down and saying, you need to do these 10 things because this is critical to your success and revenue health as a monetization, like as a company that monetizes with display advertising, we literally just do what's put in front of us.
And so one of the things off that, and thank you, Lila, because I was going to make the point without all the context you just added. So that's really fantastic. You and I our Abbott and Costello thing is going to start to really come together, because I look at this as multiple levels, and I want to be very careful what I kind of say, which is there's an aspect again around there being standards, and some of those standards helping with the transparency on both sides. Because one of the things that, like Mike mentioned right from the start, is that sometimes some of what we send in a bid request puts additional value on something that isn't actually there. And video is one of those areas that for a long time we were saying what we were saying about video, and it wasn't the actual video experience. Okay. So again, transparency, we either help build the right transparency, or we wait for the Ad Exchanger article to all publishers are ripping you off. And I'm tired of that shit. I am so tired of being labeled in that way, right? So one, standards. Two, there's the working things of like pre-bid and working at that particular level, again, around what are those things and how they work. And that takes kind of participation. I do not know that it's, let's just say, in good business, etiquette's not the word. What I'm looking for is this. We all are trying to work with our SSPs to understand, again, the best way for them to represent us. And we all do that individually. There is some aspect of this being a collective conversation. And the reason why you heard me kind of hesitate is, again, I'm not sitting there going, like, do something that, or publish something that we should not do. You have their secret sauce. That's not in our role. But there is a piece of just understanding. And I come back to even the fact that some bid requests don't pass everything because of limitations of the SSP of what they can, how many characters they accept. Just blows my mind that somehow this doesn't become something that we start to go, we need to be represented by the companies that help us grow revenue and move away from the spray and pray type of strategy. That was a little bit too much of a diatribe. Scott, please.
See, in the comments, people are asking what should be like the minimum that goes into a bid request. I'm going to come with a slightly contrarian thing, in that there is no minimum and there is no maximum. And that comes from the fact that, like, the SSPs and the bidders are the ones who are constructing the bid requests. Publishers don't do it. You don't send a bid request. Your bidders construct a piece of code that says, go find me these things and bring them back and put them into it. The importance of that is that their job is to liquidate inventory and create inventory liquidity, which means they need to have the connections with the buyers. And Mike was right about SDA and putting things in EIDs. And so it behooves the bidders to get relevant and pertinent information that others will transact on. So we can't really affect what they're putting into the bid request or what they want to do or take. If they create liquidity for you, they're a good partner. If they don't, they're not a useful partner. That's how you should be evaluating them. And sometimes it's more correlation than causation, and you can't always measure these things.
Yeah.
If the next step in answering some questions from the Q&A is like, how do you check that? We talked about talking to your SSPs, but really it's the DSPs who are going to tell you this, because it's what they're seeing. There's what you send, and then what they send, and then what they receive. If you're fortunate enough to be able to make a connection with one of the DSPs, ask them. It's fairly simple for them to do and pull a log file and show you some of these things, but it is very difficult relationship-wise to get to that level of a DSP. So
Just
we need to
I
do
would
these
even-
things together.
So
Yeah.
two things really quickly. I agree with Scott. Like, there is no maximum or minimum to a bid request, and publishers don't, as you said, don't control it. So I think that the larger question is like, how do you improve programmatic monetization? Because like that's the output that we're all trying to get to, right? And like the signals and levers you pull, amazing. But so I would say like two things that I think are very important in relation to what Scott said. Like one, I think a fascinating question to ask SSPs is like, for your curation transactions, what is the criteria of transactions today that I'm not included on as a publisher? Like what, like, oh, this is someone's doing attention targeting, or this is that, or this is this vendor. Like, what am I not being included in? What am I not being? It's kind of like reverse targeting of like curation, because it's like, what do I need to do for inclusion in that? And the SSPs can help you with that, and they have an incentive to help you with that because that's more liquidity and more opportunity for them to bid on. What the second thing that Scott said, which I also agree with, which is the SSPs don't know why a DSP bids or doesn't bid. That's why it's so vexing for an SSP, for a DSP to bid shade OpenX versus Index versus AppNexus. They have no idea, right? The SSPs pushed for a long time. It's like, oh, can we just add something to bid request that tells us, or bid response, if your response was a retargeting campaign or prospecting? And it's like, no, because then people will game it. And so there does have to be this sort of like line where, you can't disclose too much where it will be gamed. But the point I'm actually, with that transgression side, the SSP doesn't know, the DSP does, but there's really two DSPs like that make up 90% of monetization, 85% of monetization. So like, good luck trying to get them on the phone. I think more interestingly is like, who are the seats? Who are the buyers, right? Like, oh, what seat IDs are actually being compromised? Like if you can get that data, I think that's far more interesting, right? Like, hey, and if you can get with the DSP, what buyers are on your platform that are not running on my inventory today, but are active? I think that's super interesting data that I think should be exposed in some capacity for publishers. But I would just go one step further when talking to the DSP is like, see if you can pull out the seat data, right? Because the SSP should have the seat IDs of what's transacted. So you don't need to go to the DSP to get that information. The SSP should have it.
But I just want to add a little more color on that.
Yeah, please.
But within pre-bid, a lot of that information can be readily available. So like the seat, the buyer, when I was on the publisher side, I specifically have seen, to your point, Mike, is that certain campaigns will run, and there'll be a buyer campaign that needs to run through a bunch of budget, and then one SSP will pop for an hour, a day, maybe even a week, depending on how long the campaign is. So there's a lot of noise and variance in the system, but you also have to evaluate from a larger level of who are your partners on your SSP side and what value they're bringing, because you have the main SSPs, you have your Xanders or Microsoft Now, you have your Pubmatics or Magnites, and like those are your primaries, and then anything else that you bring on will be ancillary, and like what is the value that they bring? Are they working with resellers? And there's a lot of noise within the pipes there. So there's translation layers going through each and every single hop. So, evaluating which partners you're adding in and what you could do to help drive those people to be successful. So if you have like a specific niche partner that works even in a region or a specific ad format, maybe they may need specific things that, your general run-of-the-mill SSP provides or doesn't provide.
Julia's posed an interesting point in the chat, which I think kind of addresses what I wanted to mention about really what is the opportunity here. Like, why are the DSPs not engaging on this front? And I don't think it's because they don't want to, right? Like, honestly, when you find the technologists who understand these things, they really do like talking about it. And so I think ad tech is really a perfect Venn diagram of like business and technology, right? Like it's kind of equal parts. And so I think the opportunity that this, Rob and this group has is to bring the technical understanding to the business operators so everyone can really kind of get on the same page and be like, we want to transact. We know how to resolve the complexity because we understand the technicalities. And like, I think that's like really what this talk is about, is like, the bid request or the bid response or how the DSP operates or how the complexity of the open web contributes to everyone's lack of understanding and the opaqueness. Like, I don't think there's some sort of desire on anyone's part to not understand, like I guess to a certain degree, like, you want to keep, you don't want people to be able to game the system, but largely driving the technical understanding, I think, will ameliorate like a lot of these business issues. So I think, a talk
Well,
like this kind of starts that.
I love that because it's a segue to something I wanted to come back to Mike on. I've got a couple things that he has said that I want to expand on and again pull into the group, which you just said business and technology, right? And I think that that's an aspect that there is a part of this I look at, and I use the word, instead of business, I would use the word relationships, right? Which is just this aspect that, again, for all that we have done to build ad tech so that, I mean, let me start with it. Like, publishers like working with thousands of potential advertisers without having to call 1,000 advertisers. And those advertisers don't want to talk to 100,000 publishers to make one campaign work. So there has been a certain efficiency. But in that, what we've kind of learned is that because of how this all works and the volume and whatever is, again, take some of what Mike you've said, right, is that if you can get that information from the DSP, again, not most of you can't, but you get that information or the buyer, you suddenly are able to open up particular paths for the business because they do want your inventory. It's just the way that this works. You got to cut that path and then it has to perform for whatever those particular pieces are. That's hard work. There's no more easy work left as far as I can tell. Short term, yes. And again, like I've talked to some of you on this call about A/B testing, dynamic flooring, all these things. All of it you should be doing. You should be maximizing that piece. Long term, I'm not sure. It will have its place, but there's an aspect of going, like, if you're really opening up things, you use a word that Mike you use, which is merchandising, right? And you've talked about that again at IAB Tech Lab and otherwise. Can you just talk to me about when you say merchandising? It's a term we probably all understand, but I'd love to understand what it means in this context to you.
Yeah, and this is potentially slightly controversial, so I apologize in advance. But sometimes I feel, and understandably so, for a lot of publishers, there's a little bit of a sentiment where it's just like, if I just get the dials right and the configuration right, then that's going to unlock the ad spend. And that's an oversimplification. But I think it is a very sort of seductive swan song type of thing of a mindset, and I think about at the end of the day, and like it's a very difficult environment for publishers. But I think what works best is to think about the OpenRTB and bid requests as the mechanism for transaction, but not the source of demand. And I sometimes think that gets a little conflated. And I think the curation aspect is very interesting to me because I think the pendulum starts to swing back to thinking about merchandising. A very simple example I used to Rob. It's not super battle tested, so forgive me, but it's like, I like tennis, and American Express spends $30 to $40 million a year sponsoring the US Open, right? Now, it's not like the US Open just has digital billboards and everything, and they're just like, here's the opportunity, you can bid on it, right? Like, there's a very intentional sales process that has an audience overlap and mapping, and they figure out who their strategic partners are, and there's other advertisers that are in that mix. It's not just Amex. It's Rolex, it's this, it's that. So there's this correlation between audiences that leads to disproportionate value, and they may transact the creatives and the assets and things like that in programmatic ways, right? On television, on screens, and all of that jazz. but the discovery and sort of demand solicitation isn't occurring over the programmatic pipes. And to a certain degree, I feel like it's seductive to think that way, because if you turn on the programmatic pipes, you do get some discovery and ad spend. But I do think that it's really thinking about merchandising and like, who's your Amex, who's your Rolex, and maybe you're a smaller site like Rob with like golf.com. Like, it's not a huge audience, but it's very specific and highly valuable. Or you're bigger and more generic. You're Washington Post, you're CNN. Like, you know, I want to be careful because I don't want to sound like I'm preaching to publishers, and by no means that's not the note I'm trying to strike. What I'm more saying is I think there has been a tendency in the past to conflate, as I said, the mechanism of transaction with demand solicitation. And I think this curation piece is very interesting to see if we can have that slide back to, well, maybe our human-based process is finding out this overlap, and then we execute through these programmatic pipes, right? And that's what really restores some of that oversized, you know, budget swing to a publisher. I don't
Jana,
know. I don't want to be too.
No. But I think, Jana, if you're open to this, I mean, you have been one of the leaders in this, of just this aspect of, yes, programmatic, but with relationships, right? You've been on those front lines of these conversations. And so love your reaction to what Mike said. And again, just add whatever color you can to it.
Thank you, Rob. I was busy trying to, at the same time, explain something else. So yes, programmatic, or as Scott Messer would say, programmatic is not automatic, in that it takes people, and the value that you get in the open exchange is only that you are able to find an impression. And the way programmatic starts to really work for advertisers directly with a publisher is when they're having the discussion about the audience, about what they're layering on, about all of the different ways that the transactions happen. That is where the relationships, that's how all of us on this call and these panels have learned, is because we were curious enough to say, this doesn't make sense to me. Can you explain it again? I mean, I'm pretty sure maybe it was Mike O'Sullivan who I was like, can you like explain it to me like I'm an idiot, and just like, first what happens, then what happens, and that is what it takes. And if you continue down that path, eventually you'll have your own aha moment and can develop your strategies around the thing that resonates with your brand, right? What makes the Washington Post special is not the same thing that makes the New York Post special or the New York Times, but there is something that makes us unique. And what is unique about our audience is what we are selling, right? And that is, programmatic is just a transaction type at that point. The value of our property, of our audience, doesn't change. And that's why people are more important than ever.
Mike, one thing that I just posted in, two statements that you'd made during your presentation, and I just left the one out there, again, just the fact that that with all of this conversation and all the hard work it takes for publishers to succeed in the open marketplace, right? That there are some things that we can do that the walled gardens can't. But it was actually this other statement that I wanted you to dive into, of diversity of signal is key to open internet optimism. And so in one respect, and again, I'll say you said this more in our prep call than you said here. Again, though you just kind of touched on it, like as golf.com, I want to just sit there and scream through every channel, you want to buy us. And you want to buy us because we've got golfers, and God, they just can't wait to just spend money on your products. They just throw money, like whatever my story is. It's also, by the way, why I don't do sales. I'm an ad ops. But there is a piece of that that's like, I want sending unique signal. And I think some of what you're saying is that in that compression, some of those things, that isn't what's going to come through. Right. But
Right.
I want to align that to your statement about diversity of signal is key to the future of that. That's the part that I want to make sure I understand what your point was during the presentation, to this point of going like, just throwing unique shit into the bid request is not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah.
And
So on the first point, like, you're like, hey, I'm golf.com. And it's like, okay, for the vast majority of programmatic demand that doesn't know anything about golf.com, it's like IAV category 47. Cool. So is like me blogging about how I'm an idiot at golf on my GeoCities page, you know. But like, we have real journalists, they travel around the world. We have incredibly high res production value videos and content, and unique interviews with like key pros. We have events on site at all these amazing tournaments. That richness of your investment and the amazing experience that a user gets from golf.com, when you go from this to this with a bid request, it's not there. So, everything that makes golf.com great, or the fact that the Washington Post has these huge, number of like incredibly talented, highly, effective journalists, highly trained journalists, like that's not on a bid request, right? The trust that users have in an institution like the Washington Post versus, no offense, National Enquirer or something, that's not on the bid request, but they're both news, current events, politics, law, whatever, right? So like the compression, you might as well think of it this way. Another way of thinking about a bid request and compression, everything that if you are, lucky enough or fortunate enough to have a sales deck that your sales team uses that says, this is what makes us great, none of that is programmatically included in a bid request. So that's what I was trying to get at with that Amex sort of example. It's like, what makes you uniquely great is not on that bid request. Yeah. Shannon?
And that is why we sell programmatic, right? Is because we entice you with the open exchange because you just know that you like golf or you like politics, right? But if you really want to reach your, scratch golfer, or somebody who's just picking up the sport, or somebody who's, really engaged in politics, right? You have to come to us directly, and we're going to create something that is perfect for you and the person you're trying to look for, because we know our audience best and we own that relationship.
Sure.
So I want to weigh in on that, because I think that is a differentiator between size of publisher and investment in how you sell and strategy, right? Because I think to kind of start to pull this, and I'm looking to everyone to help kind of wrap up on some points. Again, this is the kind of thing you could see why I did 90 minutes, and I kind of feel like we haven't hit everything yet, right? And it's long enough, right? But there's a piece of this of like, if you are a publisher that does not have that direct sales component or that particular piece, then one, again, I'm looking for all of you, it is incumbent that you do in fact nail that bid request. Like, you understand that, and to any SSP that you can get their attention of, you at least get that piece done, and everything that you can do to suss out what's happening on the DSP there, that is in fact the game, right? And you are going to need partners to do that. You're going to need wrappers that help you dynamic price, dynamic floors, like all the pieces. You're going to need that. I'm not saying if you're bigger than that, you don't need that. I'm just saying that like the aspect is, and again, I'll make this as a broad statement, which is the ability to go and sell programmatic. If you can build that and you can get someone that opens up the doors, there's an aspect where there is more money that way. Again, I put out there, and I'm being very glib, my programmatic strategy is not to serve programmatic. Okay. It doesn't mean I don't have all the things. I got all the things and I look at them daily, but there is a piece of that that sits there and goes like, I'm not putting the future of what we do based on a business model by which someone else determines my value. And then I just get a check based on what the marketplace says I'm worth, when I don't get to sit there and wave my hands. I'm going to wave my hands as loud as I can. Done with, again, another ramble. Justin, and then to Nils. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Cool. as a publisher without the direct relationships, my takeaway from today's webinar is going to be making sure that my bid request is as good as possible with each of my SSP partners and by getting it vetted by people like Sincera. And also getting those bid requests into the right curations at the SSPs where they might be missing from. If we're not being discovered on the open market, the next best chance of discovery for our inventory as publishers is going to be in those SSP curations. I think that to me represents lowest friction towards getting discovered, and it's the next step towards finding the relationships with the direct brands. But lastly, I'm tremendously inspired by the idea of capturing seat IDs of the actual buyers so that we can pursue some type of reverse analysis, which said seat IDs are buying me here, seat IDs that look like them that should be buying me aren't. Why not? And I could seek help on that investigation with both SSP and DSP partners.
Nils, please.
I wanted to dive into two things quickly, but I think we haven't really covered it all yet. Even if as a publisher, I make the decision to primarily sell directly or even exclusively, but I'm using something like Google Ad Manager as my ad server, how do I know that my data on what users are reading my content is not being used to buy the same users programmatically on other websites that are cheaper? So from an advertiser's perspective, I actually like that. And as an advertiser, I might not care about the quality of the content if I get the KPIs I'm looking for. And a lot of advertisers have no idea what KPIs they should even be looking at.
So I do think there's something really quickly there. Like we did another presentation about MFA at Programmatic IO, and you hear some version of this, which is like, well, I'm a brand that I don't care because it performs for me. And there's kind of like that answer. And I'm like, show me a single brand where you take an actual screenshot of a real in the wild MFA site and the brand themselves says, oh yeah, good. I'm on running. I want to be 7 ads on the page of like, look at these, seamstresses from 1930. You'll never believe what they're wearing or whatever, some kind of nonsense that's like generated bullshit.
I'm totally with you on the terms of attention. I think that the attention on the advertisements, the ad density, the time in view, but also frequency cap walking is very important, but it doesn't talk about the content.
My point being, though, is when people say it performs, what they mean is, it's usually an agency person who says that. And what they mean is my end buyer, marketer, brand doesn't notice, doesn't have a problem with this. Because again, everything is reviewed in a spreadsheet. Here's where we spent your money, or it's aggregated up. Here's the impressions, the total cost of this, to that. They're not looking at like, here's the amazing, front page of golf.com or Snopes or Washington Post. They're seeing everything just compressed. It's again, the compression type of behavior. In this case, it's reporting as opposed to buying, that obfuscates how bad of an experience it is. And people misunderstand the fact that there's no complaining as, hey, it performs because I just have viewability, and all these vendors have sticky ad units that are gaming viewability. So like, I agree with what you're saying. I think there is, quite frankly, I don't know how publishers, other than building those relationships, like Rob said and Jana said, and like articulating your view on what makes you uniquely great to the buyers. I don't know if there's a way around that, because those agency people are just, deeply and gravely mistaken.
Nils, you had a second point you want to make, and then we'll go to Lila and Emery. Do not think I forgot you had your hand up. It's still up there.
Thank you.
What was your second point?
The other thing was about pretty much what do we put in the bid request. I think the tools from a publisher's perspective we use are so standardized that it does not really matter much what we put in. In fact, quite often it matters more what we potentially take out. So let's say contextual information is automatically being filled in, but it's not being used for inclusive buying. It's primarily being used for exclusive buying. So do we actually want to provide that information? Some SSPs will filter out tags that we put in, which they know it's going to hurt the buying and so on, but some don't. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I think the biggest issue from the publisher's perspective, and where we can have some influence, but also very handicapped in doing that, is that a lot of the bid requests we are sending out never arrive at the DSP. And that becomes very complex when we work with many partners, when we work with many intermediaries, and so on, when we work with reselling and other things going on. Some of it gets through, some of it doesn't get through at all. And it also changes what the DSP can see and buy on, which is then also shifting everything around. So it's creating a lot of inefficiencies. And in that regard, I think as publishers, we have a lot of control because the decisioning of what an SSP is sending to a DSP is based on their own margins. So if they know like the revenue value of that incoming request is relatively low for us, then the decision is being made, okay, we only send it to one DSP instead of 5, or we don't even run an auction at all. So then we as a publisher make sure that all of our ads are viewable, that we have an okay time in view, that we are not bombarding with too many requests, that we don't have too many paths going there. Then we can actually move our inventory and our score, which we as SSP is seeing in terms of inventory quality above the average, and potentially get to the point where the machine learning that's making all of those decisions is now starting to treat our inventory in a segment that is letting more through, or is even starting to treat it individually. But while we are sitting in this average bucket, in terms of like ad experience and performance and so on and KPIs they are seeing, there's not too much we can change with what we are submitting in the bid request. As long as we have the standards done, in my opinion, other stuff does not really matter.
I think that's a great
Thank you.
point. Lila, Emery, Jake.
Okay, there's so much, so I have to pick something.
Okay, Emery, Jake, Lila. No, okay, Lila. Please.
So a lot of this is coming down to like, oh, well, the DSPs, can't the DSPs do this? Can't the DSPs see that? Can't we send the things the DSPs want or just tell them to buy more? And the answer is no. Imagine as a trader, you don't even understand what you're buying because your DSP is not set up to support your visibility into granular optimization. You've got campaign goals, ranges, and then the bidder is going out and doing the thing that hits the goal, and you walk away and go, okay, that's great. All of a sudden you have 50 publishers coming at you going, hey, we noticed that your seed ID is missing. Let's talk about priorities here. Maybe if you're Jana, they'll pick up the phone. If you're me, they're not going to talk to me at all. So like, that's just not realistic. And I have to look at what I can do as a mid-market publisher with the things I can control. And then I have to look at who is accountable to representing me, to what you said. The SSPs are the ones brokering the programmatic transaction with the DSPs. So you know who should be calling all the DSPs? The SSPs. Do you know who should be making sure all the data is there? The SSPs. You know who should be coming to me telling me that something is missing or wrong or suboptimal? The SSPs, not me. We should all be doing this together. I get why, but I really think the pressure has to be put back to the companies we pay to do this job, which is open the door. That is the rant I will.
It turns out the SSPs are all meeting together for lunch, and if we all just sit there and quickly get there, we can go and we can surround them and get that. I do agree with Lila. I think that there is more pressure on that part. And again, to me, it will be the differentiator between the SSPs that help build our future and the ones that we just, decide not to work with anymore. Just because, again, those that actually sit there and build our businesses is where, again, that's actually, sorry, just let me one quick thing and I want to go to Emery, which is, I've said this before, we are not always the best clients for SSPs because we always are trying to sit there and negotiate to pay them the least to make us the most in a very transactional way. I'm going to give you 5% of my inventory and I'm going to kick your ass out if you don't perform. And there's an aspect of what Lila just said. You get that pressure to say, I want to understand your roadmap. I want to understand how you're going to build my business. I want this and so forth. And again, collectively or whatever. But if we get the SSPs that rise to the top and respond to that, should be getting our attention and our help, because then they will help unlock that. And I think that will be the role of the SSP kind of going forward. Or, they can just, I want to go to Emery and Jake, and then we'll see where we are on time. But John, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah,
Emery.
thanks, Rob. I just wanted to make a quick point, actually 2 quick points. Functionally, if there are publishers listening to this, quickly to share, I have done audits of bid requests by asking the SSP partners. I think Lila made an important point earlier. It's not the easiest request from an SSP, but it wasn't super challenging. One piece of advice I would give, if you plan to ask, for example, bid requests, be specific about what it is you're looking for. What we were looking for was the PLC MT transitions we made in our declarations. We were declaring that going out. We just wanted to make sure that the SSPs were passing that appropriately. It was pretty easy to check for, but that was a helpful, tangible thing when the SSP said, what are you looking for specifically? We were able to gather. I also just wanted to make a point. I think this matters now more than ever from the from the perspective of there are a lot of publishers with connections that are direct to DSPs, whether that's Backstage or OpenPath. And I think that's also created a very unique data point where for connections like that, the DSP, for example, OpenPath, the trade desk, has a direct line to what the publisher is intending through that bid request. I think that transparency is a big step forward for the industry where available. But I think it's just a point I had not heard made in this discussion that is relevant to all the discussion points.
Okay. Jake, we haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, and thank you, Rob, for organizing this call. It's a fantastic conversation. I wanted to add a bit of context. It's probably familiar to a lot of folks in the call here from our friends at Jounce Media about the DSP kind of perspective. And I think their understanding is that something like over 40% of the requests in the supply chain come from rebroadcasting. And that if there are, say, 30 million QPS in the midstream, about 1 million from their view are truly unique. So it's I think about that context a lot, and that our need to really stand out given how much filtering is happening at every level. And even the two major DSPs that don't really sample and can take in all of that, so much is already built in to take away duplicated requests, take them off the table. So I think that brings me to think about curation more, and curation on the side of the publisher. That we've done a little bit of things, particularly on viewability, to say, is there a way that we can curate the inventory with an eye toward what the SSP in question wants to see? John talks about feeding DSPs with the SSPs doing that, but I think publishers can do that to SSPs and down the line to an extent. We can only control what we can control, but I think I'm curious. We've seen a little bit of success there with certain SSPs where we curate our inventory to an extent. And see that it aligns more with their demand profile and performance, or things pick up. And I'm curious to what extent other publishers, and also on the SSP side, traffic shaping, I think, is another example of inventory curation that I think are two areas where we may have some control, or our partners, they may have control to help improve and stand out more in the noise there.
I don't know if anyone wants to jump on that. Go ahead, John, and then I want to make sure that Sean has a moment. So please, quick.
Yeah, I was just going to emphasize the point that Emery made and sort of focus on the reason for this call, which is the request, the HTTP request. This is a piece of technology that's been embedded in the heart of the web since the beginning. And just because the SSP is the person who's not getting it to the DSP correctly right now, is, that's who's doing it now. But as the industry evolves, we're going to be in the very same position very quickly with DSPs directly. So I think it's just an idea that getting smart on requests and how to build them is going to not only be applicable with SSPs, but in the future where we move to connecting directly with SSPs too. So just wanted to emphasize that point.
Appreciate that. Sean, please.
Thanks, Rob. We've been talking about lots of things regarding what to put into the requests. Something like correctly label your ad unit, GPID, etc. I'm sort of also interested in, is there a scenario whereby passing too much information in the bitstream, which hurts publisher directly? For example, as a news publisher, we also share IAS ad minx segment to SSPs. So just wondering, if we choose to not pass that, is that gonna let buyers to buy it, or how does that work? Is that gonna hurt us to pass it?
I think Nils was saying maybe not, but Mike, what do you say?
I mean, you guys tell me. When I was we went to Cannes for the first time as Sincera, and I think the ad verification space is, you know, my read is that historically somewhat adversarial to publishers. So to the extent that like if you're going to share that information, I would say like you should have a high degree of trust that that information is accurate. And that's only something that you can answer. You know, I know that time.com had that sort of thing with double verify and the Taylor Swift person of the year, and that had a huge amount of traffic that was suppressed. So only, I think each publisher has to make that calculation. I will say to Nil's point earlier in that point, like, hey, is sometimes enrichment, too much enrichment, a bad thing? We do see particularly like some interesting scenarios where publishers have like a photo gallery or some sort of like functional unit that has like different anchor points or kind of crazy UTM parameters. That can sometimes break an SSP or DSP's parsing, right? Or it's like, oh, well, it's in like safe frames and things like that. Like there's a bunch of different ways going back to the referral URL that if that breaks, like I would argue like the referral URL or like site URL are up there. They're not quite at like user ID level for cookied web, but they're critically important such that if those are broken, it will have a huge impact on monetization. So I think someone in the comments said they did a test where they tried removing UTM parameters and parameters from the URL and just make it a clean URL. I think if you're not doing that today, that's something I would encourage because it's additional information that just increases the chances that someone mangles it and gets a broken URL and throws out the request or something to that effect.
I'd add to that just that it's even more than that. It's that DSPs have a history for URLs, for viewability, for brand safety, for all their stuff. They keep a history, and if you're sending what looks like a new URL, all that history is trashed, and they're treating it like a new URL.
DSPs send us URLs for us to get metadata about those ad experiences. And we have very specific logic where it's like, do you want the exact UTM match? Or, you know, do you want any parameters? Or do you want to sort of be agnostic? And like by far, you're right, it's agnostic. So if you're sending those parameters, I agree, I would pull that off because if they have GPID optimization data, not just viewability, it's at the URL, it's at the clean URL level.
I would say
Oh, go ahead, Nils. Please just keep it
sorry.
going.
I just wanted to give a potentially good answer to this. Think about the information you're submitting. Is it more likely to be used to exclude you from campaigns or include you? If you even have to think about it, it's probably better not to send it. And the other part is think about what this information will associate you with in terms of other publishers whose inventory quality might be less than yours. So you don't want to get put into a bucket where your inventory looks similar to another publisher's that is transacting on lower volumes, like on lower CPMs, on lower bid rates. So anything you're submitting, you would want to be information that you can basically go into the wind shadow of another publisher that has higher quality inventory, because then the machine learning will kind of push you into that same bucket if it identifies it. So I would always be careful with what information to put in and make sure that it doesn't have an association that could be dragging you down.
Awesome. Thank you for that last point. One thing I'm going to sit there and say is I thought we'd be talking about ad experiences, which again is something that Mike is very much focused on. So I think we're going to have to do another conversation around that because that's ultimately, I think, what is going to be the big judgment call. We covered a lot of ground. And again, we could have kept going. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for the panel, for all of your perspectives. It is very clear to me, and I want to hit one thing that Jake touched on, just this aspect of I'm hearing more and more publishers and companies working on curation or working together by which to either create scale around things or move the needle on things, whether it be within pre-bid to IAB to whatever. Publishers need to control their own destiny. The publishers need to control your own destinies, okay? It's enough stuff with just getting a freaking check every month. Okay. You won't make it through the next couple years if you just do that. So every bit of this, you have all the things to do. Mike, I will give you this last second on that. I don't know if you want to react to what I just said. I could see the visual.
I was just curious who you're impersonating.
That's me just on a soapbox, but yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me, Rob, and for everyone for the great questions. And it was really cool to be part of your community for today. So yeah, thanks again, and feel free to message me on Rob's Slack or anything like that.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us, and have a great day.